fairly, well, it's not that early, but it's nice and quiet, as it should be. Morning time, best time to spend time with God. Been a little hard for me lately, in all honesty. Um, but I wanted to just send you a short word this morning on Sabbath. So, good morning and happy Sabbath day, or Shabbat as it's called in Hebrew. But happy Sabbath day. Today's a day that people celebrate Passover, and and also the day that Jesus rested, or was in the ground. So this was the day that the Jews were trying to celebrate and kind of move Jesus out the way. They didn't want him to upset the Sabbath, so they killed him before the Sabbath, and then wanted him buried before the Sabbath, or at least off the cross. And I want to just talk a little bit about what happened on that day. Actually, not a whole lot is recorded. I looked in all the Gospels, and there's not a whole lot recorded on that day. It's actually left very silent, for the most part. It is really that day in between. They say it's 3 days because Jesus died on a Friday night, almost night, just before night. That would be his first day. The second day would be today, the Sabbath, and tomorrow he would be dead in the morning until sometime in the morning when he rose again. That's 3 days. But the Sabbath day is very interesting to me. First, what it tells us is that Joseph of Arimathea, who had followed Jesus secretly, went and asked Pilate for his body. And Pilate was surprised. There's something in that, I don't know what it is, but Pilate was surprised that he was dead already. He was able to get his body, and this man who had served him secretly went and got him openly and buried him openly in front of everyone. He also buried him with Nicodemus, who was another one who followed him at night. And I think there's a first point there is that when we take the gospel message to such an extreme as to lay our life down for it, people who would not follow before would follow then when the self-sacrifice is demonstrated. And so in that self-sacrifice that Jesus demonstrated, he even won more over. So Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who were prominent men, they had money. They actually followed him now openly after his death. They buried him. They used myrrh and other things, which is interesting because he received frankincense and myrrh when he was a child, which is a prophecy of his death to come. And they used myrrh, and they honored his body, right, like we would do if we're burying. I buried my mother and my grandmother. I honored their remains, and we did a ceremony. They would have honored them with these things, or honored Jesus with these things, and so they were honoring him, and then they put him in a brand new tomb, which was Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, and so on this, and this is a little bit before, but it is before that day, but they honored him. Secondly, we see that the Jews they didn't want the body to be stolen, so they told Pilate they wanted a guard, and Pilate said, "Well, you have a guard, so guard him." And I think it's interesting that a lot of times we think of a Roman guard. It wasn't a Roman guard; it was a temple guard that was outside of the tomb, which to me is just kingly, right? I mean, how here is the real high priest is in the tomb, and he has a temple guard outside, even though the temple guard is supposed to be keeping him in. But I just think that's interesting. That it's kingly. That there was an honor there. There was a guard over even his death. And then look at this. They were the ones that sealed him in. So it was the enemy that wanted to seal. They put the seal on the tomb, right? The seal would be probably like some clay with a stamp on it, and that if it was broken, it would tell them that someone had broken in. And interesting that on his death, they wanted to seal that in. There are people who want to seal in your death, or seal in your destruction, or seal in your defeat. Even the world, in some sense, wants to seal in the defeat of Christianity. But even with that seal, it doesn't mean anything. Even with death and with that seal, it doesn't mean that we're irrestorable. But I think the coolest thing here is that, think about this, they had given Jesus this hard time about not honoring the Sabbath. And most of the time, when he wasn't honoring the Sabbath, he was doing miracles, or his disciples were like eating corn or something like that. If they picked off something and they said, "Oh, you're not supposed to pick," they had really made the law religious, and they were trying to hold people accountable to this law. that was over religious and was past the intent. And Jesus even said, God made the Sabbath for man, not man for the Sabbath. And and so all of his life he had demonstrated that salvation, miracles, and the love of people were more important than the scrutinized approach to straining out the gnat of the law, to bring bondage. And so Jesus demonstrated love and demonstrated salvation and miracle works versus, applying bondage with the law all of his life. But now he's silent. Finally, he has honored his Sabbath. I'm not saying he didn't honor Sabbath before. He honored it in a godly way, because the Sabbath is for the purpose of salvation. And that's what Hebrews 4 tells us about. The Sabbath was for the purpose of salvation. Entering rest was a demonstration. God didn't have to rest. He desired to enjoy rest when he created the world, and on the seventh day rested. And he invites us into that rest, through obedience and through faith. And I just think it's interesting that now Jesus says, you know what? I'm done. He was able to rest when his work was done. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 10 says, For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. So Jesus was done. His work was done now. He has completely finished it. He's won over a couple extras, right? They couldn't win over without his death. He's done his part, and now he can rest. And it's to say, and enter into the rest of God, the same rest that God had. And Hebrews talks about how we are invited into that rest. It's interesting that that rest can only be entered through obedience. That rest can only be entered through faith. And that's what Jesus did. He rested. And so this day is a day where we celebrate not only the Passover, that in Hebrew times demonstrates the grace of God protecting us from the death that is outside, which is very prevalent to today, right? But also where we celebrate our King who had finished his work and rested and honored the Sabbath himself. And not only that, but I think that we get the opportunity to join Joseph and Nicodemus, those who once secretly worshipped him, but we get to join them openly and honor our King, and honor his work by resting, and honor it by spending time with him. And so today's a day where we just honor God through our rest and through our silence and through our respect for what he's done. And so that's what today represents. It's that silent, quiet, restful day before the complete victory. It probably would have been really somber for the disciples, but I think the cool thing, I think this story is the beautiful story, right? It's not just a story, but the way that God rolled it out is that he left that sequel to come. But in today's the day we rest. So I hope that you're resting well and enjoying your family and resting in obedience. I hope that you're having faith, spending time in the Word, and honoring God today like these did, like Jesus did when he was obedient. And we will get to celebrate tomorrow. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, 10 a.m. online, and we'll do communion. So don't forget to have your juice or whatever, and then your bread or crackers ready, and we'll do communion. So God bless you guys. Have a wonderful Sabbath or Shabbat.